The oven beeped softly. I turned off the heat and let the scent of nutmeg and roasted pumpkin fill the kitchen. Outside, the rosemary bushes shivered in the autumn wind. Inside, everything stood still. Except the old wall clock, ticking like a hesitant heartbeat. I laid the embroidered napkins one by one on the table. White cloth, stitched with blue thread. The same pattern my mother used for Sunday dinners. I smoothed the edges, folded the corners, and waited. Marcus had texted that morning. "Dinner's canceled, Mom. The catering messed up." He said they'd try again another time. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded through the screen. But something in his message felt too clean, too final. Still, I made the pumpkin pie. Just in case. The crust had browned perfectly. A soft crackle when the knife passed through it. I placed it in my old tin carrier, the one I used for bake sales and funerals alike. For a while, I just sat there. Hands in my lap, fingers still smelling of cinnamon. Then Shirley knocked. She came in without waiting. A habit of old friends. She held her phone out, face pale. "Henrietta, I thought you should see this." A photo. Marcus. His wife. Their children. Everyone. Seated around a long table at Bella Verona, that fancy place downtown. Napkins folded into tulips. Glasses catching candlelight. My napkins were still folded on my table. The pie untouched. The house too quiet. I didn't cry. There wasn't even anger. I just closed the tin. Wrote on the lid with a black marker. "For someone who won't forget what love tastes like." And slid it gently into the fridge. I turned off the light. The kitchen exhaled with me. In that silence, I realized it wasn't just dinner they'd canceled. It was me. When love is no longer invited to the table, do you wait for the next invitation? Or do you start setting a new table, just for yourself? The teacup was still warm in my hands, though the tea itself had long turned bitter. I sat by the window in my worn armchair, wrapped in the patchwork shawl Marcus made in 5th grade. He chose all the wrong colors, too much orange, clashing greens. But I wore it anyway, always. The wind outside moved gently through the rosemary, each branch tapping the glass like a quiet question. Inside, everything stayed still. The air smelled faintly of last night's spice clove, cinnamon, and something scorched. A trace of burnt sugar, maybe. It made the kitchen feel haunted, but only by me. I hadn't opened the fridge yet. Didn't want to see the pie. It was easier to pretend it had already been eaten. That someone had taken a slice. That it had mattered. For someone who won't forget what love tastes like. The marker ink probably bled a little. Just enough to make the message feel older than it was. I stared at the closed refrigerator door. It looked final. That tin used to carry desserts to bake sales, potlucks, even funerals. It had dents from decades of travel. The last time it came back scratched. Marcus had said, "It just means it's loved." Now, it didn't feel loved. It felt returned. Unopened. The kitchen once held life. It used to be my rhythm, my chapel. The place where grief was folded into dough and baked into something soft. Albert would hum through his teeth while peeling apples. Marcus would sit cross-legged on the floor, sorting lentils into neat little piles. He called them flavor soldiers. I didn't have the heart to correct him. I traced the edge of the table with my finger. The grain of the wood was raised near the corner. From years of elbows, laughter, spilled gravy, and small hands drawing shapes with wet forks. I remembered one heritage dinner when we ran out of napkins. Marcus offered to wipe his mouth with his shirt sleeve. I laughed so hard, I cried into my cider. He was 8. Said, "I don't need fancy cloth, I just need your cooking." That memory used to bring comfort. Now it brought silence. They still have the napkins. They still have the dinner. But the woman who taught them the meaning of both? She's just a name on the group chat now. No reply required. I used to know the rhythm of Marcus's voice. The rise when he was excited. The hush when he was about to ask for help. But now, when he speaks to me, It's like reading a script someone else wrote. He calls less. Texts more. The messages come with emojis now. Little smiling plates and wine glasses. As if that replaces the warmth of real laughter. Last month, he sent me a photo of Eloise's piano recital. The image was lovely, her in a blue dress, hair pulled back in curls. But what caught my eye wasn't her. It was the table behind her. A lace runner I'd crocheted the year Marcus turned 12. He once called it old lady stuff. Now it sat proudly beneath a bouquet of lilies. They took the heirlooms. Left the hands that made them behind. I'm not angry. Not really. Just confused. At what point did I stop being part of the present and become someone they only reference in passing? Cora calls me Henrietta now. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Mayfield. Just Henrietta. Like I'm her neighbor. Not the woman who held her baby before she did. There was a time she used to ask for my pot roast recipe. Now she sends DoorDash gift cards on holidays. They've got a great prime rib option, she wrote last Easter. I never used them. I printed them out and used the back as scratch paper. The ink fades fast, anyway. The silence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Cordial. Tidy, even. Like when Marcus says, "We thought maybe it'd be easier if we hosted without the stress this year." Stress. That's what I became. An ingredient they forgot how to measure. Too much, and the night feels awkward. Too little, and they can say they tried. I walked into the guest room and sat at the sewing table. Pulled open the drawer. Inside lay the place cards from our last real dinner. I saved them all. Each name written in gold ink. Edges scalloped with a paper punch I'd bought just for that night. Family means not having to be perfect, Marcus had said. When I'd burned the first tray of rolls. He kissed my temple and smiled. It was only 3 years ago. But it feels like a postcard from a country I no longer belong to. One they stopped sending mail from. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table. With the gold place cards spread before me. I wasn't sure why I'd brought them out. Maybe to remind myself that I was still real. That my hands had once made things worth keeping. I arranged them in a line. Like guests arriving in silence. Albert. Marcus. Cora. Eloise. Even my own name. Henrietta. Written in Marcus's hand. The curve of the H too wide, as always. My phone buzzed. A new message from Marcus. "Hey Mom, just a heads up, we're thinking of changing up the dinner format this year. Cora's family might host something casual. You know, more modern vibe. No date. No invitation. Just a shift in tone. A soft erasure." I stared at the screen. Read the message twice. Then once more, just to be sure it said what it didn't say. Casual. Modern. Words that meant. Not like you. Not with you. I placed the phone face down. For a moment, I thought of replying. Typing out something like, "Oh, that sounds nice." Or, "Let me know if I can help." But I didn't. Instead, I folded the place cards one by one, returning each to the drawer like pressed flowers from a forgotten garden. Outside, the sky had turned a shade of gray. That always reminded me of linen left too long on the line. Soft. Heavy. I rose, slowly. My knees made their usual protest. A reminder that time passes, even when no one's watching. I reached for the embroidered table runner. The one with the vine pattern that matched our old curtains. Ran my fingers along its edge. Then folded it, too. Placed it on the bottom shelf. Beneath the cookbooks no one asks me about anymore. In the quiet that followed, I let my breath settle. It sounded louder than I expected. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt put away. Like something once useful, now politely stored. They haven't said the words. Not outright. But the message is clear. They want a version of family. Where I am no longer the table they gather around. Just the drawer they rarely open. If your presence becomes an inconvenience, would you shrink to fit their space? Or would you build a space of your own? From the hallway, I could hear laughter. High-pitched. Familiar. The kind that makes your chest ache because it used to include you. I moved closer to the window. Shirley's apartment was next door. And her kitchen window was open again. She never remembers to close it during long calls. I can't believe how grown-up Eloise looks in that dress, a woman said. I know. Shirley replied. And the cake looked incredible, like something out of a magazine. I didn't move. Didn't breathe for a second. Not because of what they were saying, but because I hadn't known there was a dress. Or a cake. Or an event that needed either. The wind rustled the rosemary bushes outside my kitchen window. The sound used to soothe me. Now it only filled the quiet. I couldn't silence myself. Back inside, the house was still. Too still. Even the floorboards, which usually creaked in sympathy, stayed silent. I returned to the table, where the pie tin still sat, untouched. The crust had cracked slightly along the edge. It always did when I rushed the folding. I hadn't meant to make the pie that day. But old habits are stubborn. Like muscle memory forged through decades of care. My phone buzzed. A photo from Cora. They were gathered in someone's backyard. String lights draped across wooden beams. A long table set with mason jars and folded napkins. I looked closer. Those were my napkins. Ivory cotton with blue vine embroidery. I had stitched them myself for our 5th heritage dinner. Each name sewn into the corner. Even Cora's. Back when I thought I'd be part of her family's forever. In the photo, Eloise stood holding a sparkler. Marcus had his arm around Cora. Everyone looked warm, relaxed, effortlessly connected. Except me. I wasn't there. Not behind the camera. Not in the caption. Not even as a passing mention. The words beneath the photo read, "Family nights are the best nights." No period. No name. No place for me. I didn't cry. But I did sit for a long time after. Hands folded in my lap. The chill from the teacup seeping through my palm. They hadn't forgotten me. They had remembered to leave me out. And somehow, that felt more permanent than silence. Later that evening, I opened the drawer where I kept old invitations. Birthday cards. Baby showers. Holiday brunches. All handwritten. All in Marcus's blocky print. They weren't just events. They were proof that I had once been wanted. I ran my finger along the edge of a faded pink envelope. Eloise's 3rd birthday. Inside was a card with glittery balloons and crooked lettering. "Can't wait to see you, Mom. Bring your apple cobbler." I remember the cobbler. It had bubbled over in the oven. Made a mess I didn't mind cleaning. Marcus had taken the last piece home. Said it reminded him of Sundays. That was only 3 years ago. But in memory, it feels like someone else's life. This year, there had been no envelope. No call. No dessert request. Only a photo sent after the fact. As if to say, "We thought of you, just not in time." I sat down at the kitchen table. The chair creaked beneath me, a familiar sound. One of the few left. I wasn't angry. No, anger would have implied I expected more. What I felt was thinner. Harder to hold. Like trying to catch steam. Marcus hadn't meant to hurt me. But he had. Not with a cruel word. But with a soft silence. And perhaps that's worse. Because when someone screams at you, at least they still think you're close enough to hear. He lied, gently. Wrapped it in care. "Dinner's cancelled, Mom." The caterer fell through. Said like a kindness. Offered like mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was avoidance. A refusal to say the harder truth. That the dinner wasn't cancelled. Only my place at it. The clock on the wall ticked like it always had. But tonight, it felt louder. As if it was trying to remind me of all the time I had given them. And the quiet I'd now been left with. I looked across the table at the empty chair across from mine. Albert's chair. Still pushed in neatly. As though he'd be back. He wouldn't. Neither, it seemed, would they. I stayed like that for a long time. The hum of the fridge, the only company left. The first heritage dinner after Albert passed was the quietest we ever had. No one said so aloud, but every chair knew who was missing. I remember setting the table that year with more care than usual, ironing each napkin, polishing the silver that hadn't seen daylight in months. Grief makes you reach for order, even in things that don't speak. Marcus arrived late. His eyes were red, but he smiled. He brought a bottle of wine he couldn't pronounce. Said Albert would have hated it. Then laughed too hard at his own joke. I served roast chicken and sweet carrots. We didn't say grace, but there was reverence in the silence. At dessert, Marcus raised a toast. To Mom, he said. The glue. I remember the warmth in my chest. I didn't need more than that. A sentence. A look. He saw me. Then. I blinked back to now. The kitchen was dim. Only the amber light above the stove stayed on, casting long shadows over the empty table. I rose and walked to the sideboard, where we used to keep family photos. Only 2 frames remained. Eloise in her kindergarten cap. Marcus and Cora on their wedding day. No Albert. No me. I searched the drawer, hoping, though I didn't know for what. In the back, I found a photo tucked behind old receipts. It was one of the early dinners. Marcus, age 12, holding a turkey leg like a trophy. My hand on his shoulder. My face was half-cropped. The photo not taken with care. But I was there. I held it between both palms, as if warmth could be transferred back into it. Then I heard it again. Not a voice, but a memory. Marcus, in his teen years, once said, Mom, not everything has to be a tradition. He was frustrated that year. Didn't want to fold napkins or wear a sweater. I brushed it off then. But now the words echo different. Not everything has to be a tradition. Not everyone, either. I placed the photo back gently. Closed the drawer. In families, sometimes they don't slam the door. They just stop opening it. And you're left standing outside, still holding the keys. If you are no longer welcome at your own table, is it dignity to knock again? Or strength to walk away? It started with a letter I nearly threw away. A plain envelope, no return address, tucked between a grocery coupon and a dentist flyer. I almost tossed the whole bundle. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the weight of it. Heavier than junk mail. I sat at the kitchen table. The same spot where I used to pay bills with Albert beside me. Writing checks while sipping his weak coffee. 1 sugar, no cream. I slit the envelope open with the butter knife. Inside, a statement from the credit union. Strange. That account hadn't sent paper mail in years. I unfolded the page slowly, as if it might change its contents if I moved too quickly. And there it was. A line printed in black. Ordinary and devastating. Joint account holder added, Marcus J. Mayfield. I stared at it. Read it again. Then a 3rd time. Waiting for the sentence to soften. It didn't. The date was 3 weeks ago. No signature required, it said. Because he was listed as beneficiary of record. Beneficiary. That word sat on my tongue like rust. The account had been mine since 1984. Opened with Albert. Meant to be our emergency cushion. After he passed, I kept it going out of habit. And because it held the last of our shared intentions. We never touched it for holidays. Never dipped into it for repairs. It was sacred. In a quiet, responsible way. And now, Marcus had his name on it. No conversation. No request. Just a line of ink and a quiet assumption. I folded the statement back along its creases. Laid it gently on the table. As though it were fragile. But it wasn't the paper that was fragile. It was the trust. I sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It sounded louder today. Like it knew something I didn't. I tried to remember the last real conversation I had with Marcus. Not a text. Not a photo. A full, adult conversation. I couldn't recall one. Only fragments. Don't worry about it, Mom. We'll take care of everything. You can relax now. Relax. That word suddenly felt like a warning. Like a quiet way of saying, we've already decided. The next morning, I pulled down the tin box from the top shelf. The one labeled important papers in Albert's handwriting. The ink had faded, but the letters still bore his deliberate weight. I set the box on the dining table, wiped the lid with the sleeve of my cardigan. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Inside, folders, neatly stacked. Some clipped shut with rusting paper clips. Others yellowed around the edges, but still intact. Receipts. Loan payoffs. The deed to the house ours. Even though now I lived in it alone. And toward the bottom, our old account documents. I found the original form from 1984. Albert's signature beside mine. We had gone together to open it, both still wearing our school cafeteria uniforms. Hair smelling faintly of onions and dish soap. He had said, "This is for later. Not for now, not for groceries. For after." We never defined after. But we honored it. Even when money got tight. Even when Marcus needed braces. Or when the roof leaked. We never touched that account. Now, my name was no longer the only one on it. And no one had asked. No one had looked me in the eye and said, "May I?" I flipped through more pages. Found a note Albert had tucked into the back of the folder. His handwriting, faster this time. Just a short sentence. "Henrietta knows what matters." I read it again. Then again. As if it might offer instruction. A key I had forgotten how to use. Instead, it only offered grief. Because the Henrietta he knew. The one who measured every cup of flour twice. Who cross-checked receipts and circled interest rates. Would never have let this happen. But I had. By trusting too long. By not checking. By assuming love would come with consultation. I sat very still. The box opened beside me. Paper resting against my knees like unanswered questions. What else had changed? How many lines had been redrawn? Without the courtesy of a conversation? I thought about Marcus's voice on the phone. All those times he'd said, "Don't worry, Mom. I've got it covered." I used to think that was comfort. Now I wasn't sure. Was it protection? Or possession? And how long had I mistaken one for the other? That afternoon, Marcus called. His name lit up on the screen. But I didn't answer right away. I watched it ring. Watched it stop. Then came the message. "Hey Mom, just wanted to give you a heads up. We added my name to the account, figured it'd be safer. You know, just in case anything ever happened. Cora said it's better to have things in place. Hope that's okay." No question mark. Just a soft landing. As if the decision had already been patted in politeness. I didn't reply. I walked instead to the cabinet beneath the hallway mirror, where we kept the fireproof box. Inside were my medical papers. The will Albert and I had drafted when Marcus was 12. And an envelope labeled in my handwriting. "Do not open unless you need to." I took it out. Opened it. Inside were instructions I had written years ago. Bank names. Account numbers. Who to contact. What to do. I had done all this once with clarity. Now it felt distant. I sat down with a pen. And began rewriting the note. Not to update the facts. But to reclaim the voice. This time I wrote. "If anything happens to me, I trust my decisions to stand as I made them. Not as others revised them." I folded it slowly. Pressed the crease firm with the side of my nail. Placed it back into a new envelope. This one I labeled with 4 words. Not yet obsolete. I placed the envelope at the top of the stack. Closed the box. Locked it. In the kitchen, the oven timer beeped from nothing. An echo from a habit I hadn't broken. I didn't need to bake anything. But I preheated the oven anyway. Sometimes action is the only way. To remind yourself you still exist. Marcus's message still sat on the phone. Unread. But not unseen. They had taken access. But not memory. Not dignity. That part remained. Even if only on paper. If they can add a name without your voice, can you still leave behind a legacy they don't get to rewrite? I left the house 2 days before Thanksgiving. No announcement. No note on the fridge. Just zipped my overnight bag and watered the rosemary. The soil was dry. I pressed my finger in, gently. The way Albert used to test when to water the tomatoes. I left the kitchen light on. It made the house look occupied. But it wasn't. Not really. Shirley offered her guest room. Said she and her daughter were going to Spokane. I told her I'd watch the plants. But really, I just needed somewhere. That wasn't mine. She handed me the key with both hands. Like passing a small, quiet kindness. She didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. She had lived long enough to recognize when someone didn't want to explain their leaving. The house was small. 1 bedroom, soft carpets, a recliner with fabric worn smooth. There was a bowl of peppermints by the door. They were the soft kind, the ones that melt. I took 2. Held them in my palm like something sacred. I unpacked slowly. Laid out my pajamas, a book I hadn't opened in weeks. A sweater that still smelled faintly of pie spice. I moved around the house without purpose. Opened a drawer, closed it. Touched a picture frame, turned it face down. At dusk, I sat in the recliner. Didn't turn on the sound. The weatherman gestured to clouds. But I only watched his hands move. My reflection in the window didn't move. It just sat. Like a painting someone had forgotten to hang. The blanket on the couch was lavender-scented. Too new. Too unstained. It hadn't known spilled gravy, or the weight of children asleep beneath it. I wrapped it around my shoulders. But it didn't warm. Only softened the shape of my edges. I thought about Marcus's table. If the cranberry sauce had set properly. If anyone remembered to pass the salt before reaching for dessert. I wondered if my name came up. Even in passing. Even as a brief, polite omission. Mom's resting. She's not up for company this year. She sent her love. But I hadn't. No one had asked. And I had nothing left to send. The silence in Shirley's house wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was just spacious. Like a theater after the audience leaves. I lay down on the guest bed. The ceiling fan clicked. Not broken, just tired. I counted the rotations like I used to count breaths in childbirth. Back then, I was preparing to meet life. Now, I was preparing to meet quiet. Not death. But something adjacent. A version of myself that no longer asked to be heard. Just to be left intact. I woke up before the sky turned blue. There was no reason. No sound. Just that old pull from somewhere in my chest. The same one that used to get me up early to prepare breakfast for everyone. I lay there a while. Watching the shadow of the ceiling fan carve lazy circles overhead. The sheets were still tucked in at the corners. I hadn't moved much. There's a certain stillness that only comes when no one is expecting you. I slipped on my shoes. Didn't bother with socks. Tied my coat at the waist and stepped out into the cold morning. The sidewalk was wet with frost. Grass blades stiff under the streetlight. Each breath hung in the air like something unfinished. I passed the bakery on Pine Street. It was closed. But someone was inside. A young man in a white apron. Measuring flour like he had somewhere to be. Through the next window. A family was setting up folding chairs in a dining room too small for the table. A child bounced around with paper streamers. A woman stirred something in a red pot. The window was open just enough for the sound of a song to slip through. Old holiday jazz. Clarinet. A soft drum. Not joyful. Just familiar. I stood there longer than I should have. My hands tucked deep into my pockets. The music was a time machine. Back to when Albert hummed under his breath while basting the roast. Back to Marcus pulling on my apron strings, asking if he could taste the stuffing early. Back when I was needed. Seen. Tied to something real. Now I was just a witness. to other people's warmth, to windows that opened for someone else. The sky lightened. Pink stretched across the rooftops like something trying to remember how to rise. I walked 2 more blocks. Didn't look up. Didn't look down. Just forward. That was the part that scared me most. Not the loneliness, but the unmooring. I had spent decades orbiting others. Meals. Schedules. Holidays. Emotions. Now that the gravity was gone, I wasn't sure what kept me from floating off entirely. I passed a hardware store. Its windows were fogged. No one inside yet. But a handwritten sign on the door read, "Back in 10 minutes. Just stepped out." It made me laugh. Quietly. A small puff of fog in the air. The world kept turning. Even when no one saw you leave. I turned back toward Shirley's house. The sky now brightening behind me. If your whole life was spent building warmth for others, what do you hold on to? When none of them need your fire anymore? I returned home 3 days later. The rosemary bush had browned at the edges. I hadn't expected frost that heavy. But I didn't feel guilty. Not like before. I stood outside the front door longer than necessary, keys in hand, letting the cold settle into my shoulders. It reminded me I still had skin. Inside, the house smelled faintly of closed windows and something stale. Not rot. Not neglect. Just a space that hadn't been lived in. I walked from room to room without turning on the lights. Let the shape of furniture guide me. Let the floor remember me by the sound of my steps. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Pie tin still covered. Clock blinking. Its red numbers reminding me that time had passed. But not much else. I stood at the sink and washed my hands. Not because they were dirty, but because the water grounded me. Warm. Then hot. I let it run. Steam rose around my fingers. And for a moment, I watched it like a ceremony. A quiet baptism. I dried my hands on the same dish towel I'd used for years. The edges were frayed. One corner stained with something too old to identify. I folded it slowly. Set it on the counter. Square. Centered. Then I opened the pantry. Took out the jar of flour. Set it beside the sugar. Didn't know what I was baking. Didn't care. I didn't preheat the oven. I wasn't ready for fire. Only form. That evening, I sat on the edge of my bed, facing the mirror. The hallway light cast a soft line across my cheek. I studied myself. Not for flaws, but for evidence. Of breath. Of decision. Of survival. I didn't look proud. Or sad. Just present. I pulled open the drawer beside me. Inside were old index cards. Recipes, each one in my own cursive. Faded ink. Stains like fingerprints. I chose one without looking. Pumpkin bread. Albert's favorite. I held it in both hands. Not to read. To feel the weight of something made before forgetting began. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved. But because there was no room left for mourning. Only movement. I placed the card on the nightstand. Smoothed the corners. That night, I slept with the window cracked open. And the recipe beside me. I didn't dream of Marcus. Or Eloise. Or family dinners. I dreamt of warm bread. And hands that knew what to do. Even when no one else asked them to. The next morning, I dressed slower than usual. Not because I was tired. But because I was listening. To the quiet. To the soft protest of my knees. To the way the house held its breath when I moved. I buttoned my cardigan all the way up. Chose the brooch with the tiny silver spoon. A gift from a student years ago. She'd said, "So you never forget how good you made lunch taste." I pinned it carefully. Not for anyone else. Just to remember that girl still existed. Somewhere. Outside, the air was cold but bearable. I took the long route down Evergreen Lane. Past the mailboxes that hadn't been painted in years. Past the dog that never barked at me. The sidewalk curved around the park. I didn't stop. Just nodded to the benches like old acquaintances. At the corner, the brick building came into view. Boise Community Center. Letters slightly chipped. A poster flapping at the edge of the glass door. Fall programs now open. All ages welcome. I stepped inside. The warmth was instant. Not just temperature, but presence. Someone was mopping near the lobby desk. A woman behind the counter looked up. Smiled. Didn't ask why I was there. Just waited. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, I said. That's all right, she replied. Most people aren't. She handed me a clipboard. Forms stapled neatly. Boxes to tick. Cooking workshops. Memoir writing. Holiday craft circles. Sunday meals. I paused at the last one. Sunday table, weekly community potluck. No one eats alone. My fingers stayed there longer than they should have. I didn't tick the box. Not yet. Just circled it softly with my thumb. Take your time, the woman said. I'm not good at groups, I admitted. You don't have to be, she replied. Just be good at showing up. I nodded. Folded the form in half. Tucked it into my coat pocket. As I turned to leave, a woman near the entrance caught my eye. Gray hair tied in a scarf. She was sitting quietly, hands folded over a tote bag. She looked up. Met my gaze. Didn't smile. Just nodded once. And I nodded back. Nothing spoken. But something passed between us. Recognition. Not of name. But of shape. Two women with time on their hands. And stories pressed beneath their ribs. I stepped outside. The wind met me. But I didn't shrink from it. I walked home with the paper still in my pocket. Not as a plan, but as proof. I had gone. I had walked in. I had been seen. And I hadn't disappeared. That afternoon, I stood in the middle of my kitchen and listened to the silence. But this time, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt open, like a blank page, or an unwritten recipe. I pulled the apron from its hook behind the door. It still had a faint mark of turmeric near the hem, from a failed curry experiment last winter. I'd blamed the recipe. Albert would have blamed the pot. And Marcus would have said, order takeout next time. I smiled at that. Not out of warmth, but out of recognition. We had all been versions of ourselves. Once. I tied the apron around my waist. Opened the cupboard. Chose ingredients not out of habit, but from curiosity. Cardamom. Molasses. Orange zest. Nothing traditional. Nothing they would have asked for. But something that made my hands pause with interest. I didn't follow a recipe. Just trusted the memory of texture. The way the batter should feel against the spoon. The oven ticked as it warmed. A sound I had missed. Like an old friend clearing their throat. I lined the pan. Poured the thick mixture in. Scraped the sides with the back of the spatula. The way my mother had shown me. With the same precision she used in grief. As it baked, the house began to change. Slowly. First with scent. Then with warmth. Then with breath. I wiped the counter clean. Folded the dish towel. Checked the oven light. The top browned faster than expected. A crack appeared through the center. Not pretty, but real. I didn't rush to take it out. Didn't worry about perfection. Just waited. Trusted. When I finally placed it on the rack, steam curled up like ribbon. The smell was unfamiliar, but comforting. I cut a slice too early. It crumbled. But the center was soft. Spiced. Bold. I sat at the table. A bite on the plate. A warm knife resting beside it. The window let in a ribbon of late afternoon light. It hit the table edge. Lit up the flour still dusting my sleeve. I reached for the recipe box. Pulled out the card for Albert's favorite pumpkin bread. On the back, I wrote a new variation. The one I'd just made. At the bottom, I added, for the version of me that kept going. then slid it into the back of the box. Not to hide it, but to hold it. That night, I didn't wait for a message. Didn't check for a photo. Didn't imagine a chair set aside for me. Instead, I filled my own seat. With a full plate. And no apologies. The morning sun crept across the floorboards, catching the edge of the dining table. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a pen in one hand, and the folded registration form in the other. The paper had a crease down the center, from where I'd tucked it in my coat pocket days ago. It smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. Or maybe that was just my hands. I set it down on the table, stared at the line that read, "Would you like to volunteer as a host?" I hadn't circled it before. Hadn't trusted myself to claim that word. Host. It used to be a title I wore naturally. Without thinking. I knew how to set a table. How to read a room. How to fold silence into warmth. But that had been for people who now saw me as a relic. A sweet story. A faded note. I picked up the pen. Drew a slow, deliberate circle around the word. The ink bled slightly into the paper. Permanent enough. I flipped the form over. Blank on the back. Except for the header. Additional comments, optional. I wrote one line. Not for them. For me. Not a guest. A host. I folded it back into thirds. Pressed the edges smooth. Slipped it into a clean envelope. And set it near the front door. Later that day, I took the bus downtown. It had been years. The rhythm of stops felt unfamiliar. But I let the motion rock me gently. Like memory. I stepped off near the linen shop on Maple Avenue. The same one Albert and I used to browse. Before the holidays. We never bought anything. But we'd always talk about next year's table. Inside, the shelves were neater than I remembered. Color-coded. Perfect folds. All silent. I ran my hand across the fabrics. Past the crisp whites. The spring florals. The dull grays. My fingers stopped at a mustard-colored linen, with stitched edges and a slight wrinkle in the corner. It wasn't trendy. It wasn't subtle. But it was warm. And it was mine. I bought it. Didn't ask for a gift receipt. On the way home. I didn't rehearse explanations. Didn't imagine who would sit at the table. I only knew one thing. It wouldn't be empty. Not because of the guest list. But because I had returned to it. I stepped back into my kitchen. Unfolded the cloth. Laid it across the table. It wasn't centered perfectly. One edge hung lower than the other. I didn't fix it. Just stood there. Watching how the color caught the last of the afternoon light. This time, the table didn't wait for someone else. It waited for me. The next day, I put on my navy coat. The one with the loose button and worn cuffs. It didn't look impressive. But it had been with me through years of quiet decisions. I tucked the envelope into my handbag. Pressed it between a packet of tissues and a small tin of mints. Just in case I needed something familiar to hold. The bus was late. The sky was overcast. But I didn't mind the wait. I sat on the bench, hands folded, watching leaves drift down like soft reminders that letting go could still be beautiful. When I arrived at the center, the lobby felt warmer than I remembered. Or maybe I was just more open to noticing. The same woman was at the front desk. She looked up as I approached. Recognition in her eyes. But no assumptions. "I brought something," I said. She reached out her hand. I passed her the envelope. She opened it slowly. Scanned the form. When she reached the line I had circled, she looked up again. "Would you be interested in hosting a Sunday table?" she asked. I nodded. Not quickly. Not with apology. Just firmly. "Have you ever hosted a meal before?" I almost laughed. But I didn't. I thought of every Thanksgiving. Every Wednesday night meatloaf. Every funeral casserole. Every birthday cake with icing that cracked. "Not formally," I said. "But yes." She smiled. "Then you're ahead of most." I stood there for a moment. I'm not sure if I was supposed to say more. But she didn't ask for more. Only gave me a clipboard. Here's what we'll need, she said. A short checklist. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough to feel like something real was beginning. I left the building with the paper in my coat pocket. This one didn't fold neatly. It crinkled at the edges. I didn't mind. At home, I cleared a small space on the counter. Set the list beside a notepad. Tore off the top page. In my handwriting, still steady, though slower, I wrote, Sunday table, all welcome. No one eats alone. I underlined it once. With a pencil. Not a marker. Pencil can be changed. But it also waits longer before fading. I tacked it to the fridge with a chipped magnet. From a trip Albert and I took to Coeur d'Alene in 1987. The lake had been cold. The coffee weak. But we laughed the entire weekend. As I stepped back, the paper fluttered slightly. Like breath. It wasn't a billboard. Or an announcement. Just a quiet promise. To the room that had held me. Through all the forgetting. Now, I was writing something new. Not louder. Just clearer. That Sunday morning, I woke before the sun. Not out of worry. Not from habit. But because something in me was already waiting. The house was quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It felt clean. Like a table just wiped down. I started with the dishes. Took out the older set. Not the fine china tucked away for guests that never came. These were mismatched. Faded with time. But they felt like mine. I washed each one carefully. Not because they were dirty. But because it felt like honoring them. Honoring myself. Then the glasses. Some cloudy from age. I wiped each with a soft cloth. Holding them up to the window. Until the light passed through just enough. The kitchen filled with warmth slowly. Not from the oven. But from motion. Purpose. I laid the mustard-colored tablecloth across the dining table. Smoothed its surface with the side of my hand. It still had a crease from the packaging. I left it. Not everything needs to unfold perfectly on the first try. I opened the recipe box. Pulled out the card for potato rolls. Albert's handwriting on the top right corner. Add extra butter. I smiled. Let the memory come. Then let it go. Like steam rising. As the dough rose, I brewed a pot of coffee. The good kind. Not the instant packets I'd been settling for. The smell filled the room. And curled into the corners of the house. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick differently. Not faster. Not slower. Just present. I set the table for 6. Not because I expected 6. But because hope deserves space. Napkins folded, not ironed. A pitcher of lemon water. Not crystal, but glass. Salt and pepper shakers that had once belonged to my mother. Still shaped like tiny birds. I placed a small sign in the window. Sunday table. All welcome. No times. No RSVP. Just a door. And a table. At 10:30, I sat down. Tucked my hands into my lap. Listened to the hum of the heater. The occasional creak of the floor. The sound of something becoming. No one knocked. Not yet. But I didn't feel foolish. I didn't feel forgotten. Because this table was not for proving anything. It was for practicing presence. And today, I showed up. That, I decided, was a beginning. Even if it looked like waiting. Even if the only sound was the soft crackle of bread cooling on a wire rack by the window. By 11 o'clock, I had nearly accepted that no one would come. The coffee had cooled. The rules had settled. The light through the window had shifted slightly. A reminder that time moves even when we don't. Then came the sound. Not a knock. Just a hesitant shuffle outside the door. I waited. The door creaked before I could reach it. And there she stood. The woman from the community center. The one with the scarf and quiet eyes. She didn't smile. Didn't offer a reason. She just looked down at the sign in the window. Then back at me. As if to say, "You said all welcome. Was that true?" I stepped aside. She walked in. No words. Just two women in the same room. Both used to being too much and not enough at the same time. I gestured to the table. She chose the seat across from mine. Folded her hands neatly. I poured her coffee. She added sugar without asking. Tore a roll in half. Still, no one spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Like we were sitting in a room that used to be a church. And neither of us wanted to wake the old ghosts. After a few bites, she looked up. "You cook like someone who's fed a lot of people," she said. I nodded. "Not recently." She nodded back. "That'll change." That was all. And somehow, it was enough. At 11:42, my phone buzzed. Face down on the sideboard. Muted, but insistent. I let it ring. Once. Twice. Then stop. I didn't reach for it. Not out of defiance. But because I was still in the middle of something sacred. A table that was full. Even with only 2 chairs occupied. Later, I checked. A message from Marcus. "Hey Mom. Saw something about your Sunday table on the community board. Didn't know you were doing that. That's cool. Want to catch up this week? We could swing by. Just us. Let me know." No apology. No acknowledgement of the empty seats left behind. Just a casual offer to return. But this time, I wasn't sure I had room. Not out of bitterness. But because I'd already started filling the chairs. With people who knocked. Instead of assumed. I set the phone down. Poured the woman another cup. We didn't talk about children. Or inheritance. Or what used to be. We talked about soup. And weather. And things still worth cooking for. It wasn't justice with thunder. It was dignity served warm. And I'd never tasted anything quite like it. He came the following Sunday. Not with Cora. Not with Eloise. Just him. I saw his car pull up through the front window. He hesitated before getting out. Checked his phone. Then pocketed it without looking at the screen again. I didn't move to meet him at the door. Didn't fluff the napkins, or rehearse a greeting. I simply kept wiping down the table. Slow, even strokes. Like finishing something I had started long before he arrived. He stepped into the building like it belonged to someone else. Because it did. "Hi, Mom." His voice carried a familiar softness. The one he used when asking for things. When trying to patch what hadn't quite broken. But bent. "This is nice," he added, eyes scanning the room. A folding chair. A bowl of lemons. The mustard tablecloth. He smiled at it small, crooked. "You always did like yellow." I nodded. Offered him a seat. Not the one at the head of the table. There were no such seats here. He sat. Took a sip of water. Cleared his throat. "I didn't know you were doing all this." "You didn't ask," I said. Not cruel. Just true. He looked down. Then back up. "I guess I thought, after Dad, after everything, you wanted to rest. Didn't want to be in the middle of things anymore." I met his eyes. Held them just long enough. "I never said that." He nodded slowly. Picked up the salt shaker. Put it down again. Hands unsure. Like a boy at someone else's dinner table. "I miss your rolls," he said. "That's not a reason to visit," I replied. He smiled at that. Not hurt. Just honest. There was a pause between us. A kind of clearing. Not silence. But space. He looked around the room again. At the corkboard with the flyer I had handwritten. At the stack of chipped plates drying near the sink. At the door still slightly ajar. "Do you want me to come next week?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I wiped my hands. Straightened the sugar bowl. Then looked at him. "You're welcome," I said. Same as anyone else. But not more than them. His face changed. Just slightly. Not in pain. But in recognition. For the first time, he saw me seated at a table he hadn't built. And realized I didn't need to be invited back into something I'd outgrown. I didn't reclaim my place. I created one. He reached for another roll. Didn't ask. Just took one. A quiet gesture. The kind that knows what's already been spoken. Outside, the light was starting to fade. Inside, the table stayed warm. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from being heard. It comes from choosing what no longer needs to be said. After he left, I didn't move right away. The room still carried his shape. Not in noise, but in the way a seat stays warm for a while after someone stands. I looked down at the table. A few crumbs. Half a cup of tea he hadn't finished. The butter dish slightly ajar. I didn't rush to clear it. Let it sit. Let it breathe. Marcus hadn't apologized. Not with words. But somewhere in his pause. In the way he folded his napkin before rising. There was something that felt like acknowledgement. Not regret. Just recognition. The kind you offer not when you want to go back, but when you finally understand why you can't. I walked to the window. The sky was bruised with evening. Street lamps blinked on slowly. One at a time. Like people remembering their place in the dark. Across the street, someone was dragging 2 chairs onto a porch. Not for a party. Just for sitting. Side by side. Without a script. I went to the kitchen. Turned off the coffee pot. The smell lingered. Clinging to the air like old laughter. The recipe box still sat open. Cards slightly tilted. Some warped from heat. Some smudged with oil and ink. I pulled out the oldest one. Apple crisp. My mother's handwriting. Slanted and sure. I held it for a moment. Then closed the box. Not out of rejection. But because it had served its purpose. I didn't lock it away. Just returned it to its drawer. Between the measuring spoons and a roll of wax paper. I wiped down the counter. Folded the towel. Ran water over the sponge and set it upright in its dish. Each action quiet. Unremarkable. But entirely mine. There was no applause. No one to witness. Only the clock ticking in its steady way. Unimpressed. But constant. Before I turned out the light, I glanced at the sign on the fridge. Sunday table, all welcome. I left it there. Even if no one else read it. I had. And I believed it. Justice hadn't arrived with fanfare. It hadn't knocked or demanded to be seen. It had taken a seat. Without asking. Without needing permission. And I had set the table for it. Not to make a point. But to make space. That night, I didn't wait for calls. Didn't check for messages. I poured myself a cup of warm milk. Carried it to the living room. And sat in the chair by the window. With no need to be anything. But at peace. The morning light came through the kitchen windows like warm butter. Slow, golden. Softening everything it touched. I stood at the counter. Copying a recipe by hand. Not from the box. From memory. I didn't rush. Didn't aim for perfect measurements. Only wrote what I remembered by feel. 2 pinches of salt, not more. Fold the batter gently. Taste before judging. The last line wasn't part of the ingredients. But I included it anyway. Someone had asked me for this recipe. A woman from last week's Sunday table. Younger. Maybe late 40s. She'd asked shyly. After her second helping of the spiced molasses cake. Would you mind sharing how you made this? I'd smiled. Not from pride. But from the small spark inside. The one that flickers. When someone sees worth in something you made. Without asking who taught you. Now, I folded the page. Slipped it into an envelope. No name on the front. Just. For someone hungry enough to try. I placed it in the small wooden tray by the door. The one where people sometimes left thank you notes. Or scribbled recipes of their own. Last week, someone had brought tomato jam. The week before, leftover meatloaf. None of it was fancy. All of it was shared. The table had grown. Not in size, but in spirit. We didn't talk about holidays. Or broken ties. Or who didn't show up. We passed salt. Asked about soup. Held silence when needed. Sometimes, healing sounds like the scrape of chairs on old linoleum. Sometimes, it doesn't sound like anything at all. I watered the rosemary on the windowsill. It had perked back up after the frost. I'd repotted it in a bigger container. Gave it more room. I understood that feeling. A card arrived in the mail that afternoon. From Eloise. A drawing of a table. Stick figures with wild hair and crooked smiles. On the back. Daddy says you make the best rolls. I hope you make them for me someday. I traced her handwriting with my finger. Didn't cry. But something in my chest opened. Not like a wound. Like a window. I placed the card beside the others on the sideboard. Not displayed. Just resting. Safe. Later, as the sky blushed toward evening, I sat at the Sunday table alone. Not because no one came, but because I was early. I liked the stillness before the room filled. The anticipation. Not of guests, but of warmth. I looked at the extra chairs. Some had cushions now. Some still wobbled. All were different. None matched. And that, I'd come to realize, was the point. We weren't building replicas. Of old tables. Old roles. Old expectations. We were building something new. With hands that remembered. And hearts that didn't need to be told. How to set a place. The letter came in a plain envelope. No return address. Just a single stamp. Slightly off-center. I opened it at the kitchen table. Sunlight pooling under my elbows. The rosemary on the windowsill leaning toward the glass. The handwriting was careful. Rounded letters, like someone hadn't written by hand in a while. Dear Henrietta. It began. I came to Sunday table 2 weeks ago. I didn't speak. I didn't even eat much. But I sat in the corner and watched. And something shifted. I paused, letting the words breathe. I lost my sister last year. Holidays have been hard. I'd stopped cooking. Stopped sitting at tables. Until yours. There was no signature at the bottom. Just, thank you for remembering how to welcome people like me. The ones who don't even knock anymore. I folded the letter slowly. Held it for a moment in both hands. Not to press it flat. But to keep it warm. Then I slid it into the sideboard drawer. Between the folded tablecloths and the recipe cards. Now curling at the edges from use. The next Sunday, I rewrote the sign. Not because the old one had worn out. But because the words had grown. The original still read. Sunday table, all welcome. I added a second line. In smaller letters. Pencil first, then ink. Where forgotten things become ingredients again. I pinned it beside the door. Not for attention. For clarity. That morning, as I set the table, I used the good plates. The ones I kept hidden away for too long. Not for guests. For proof. That what I had saved was still good. The room filled slowly. A neighbor brought soup. A boy I didn't recognize carried in a tin of cornbread. No one asked who was in charge. They simply found the rhythm of passing, pouring, offering. At one point, I looked up. And caught Marcus standing just outside the doorway. He didn't enter. Didn't interrupt. Just watched for a moment. Nodded. And left. I didn't follow. Didn't wave. He had seen enough. And so had I. By evening, I was alone again. The table half cleared. The kettle still warm. I wiped the surface clean. Stacked the plates. Left a few crumbs behind. Deliberately. Because not everything needs to be erased. I sat with a cup of tea by the window. The kind with cloves and orange peel. The kind no one ever requested, but always finished. Outside, the street was quiet. A single porch light flickered on across the way. I didn't feel full, but I didn't feel empty, either. Somewhere in between. Where memory doesn't sting, but settles. Where forgiveness isn't asked for, but folded into the fabric of the day. I reached for my notebook. Wrote down one last thing. Beneath the day's menu. What does legacy taste like? When no one is watching?